If this story moves you, stay until the end and consider subscribing for more real, heart-led stories. Rain made the Christmas lights puddle into the gutter like spilled stars. Daniel pulled the collar of his coat higher and felt the familiar press of traffic through the wheel, the steady weight of his son's small body against the passenger door. Leo chattered about the paper crowns tucked into his backpack and the exact number of jingles on the sleigh bell ornament he hoped to give a child who needed one. Daniel listened more than he answered, the way a man learns the shape of his son's questions without always speaking to them. He had the list, the orphanage's wish list folded in his pocket, the rustling paper that smelled faintly of printer ink and peppermint from the cafe where he'd made the copies. He had his card in his wallet to cover what the orphanage needed. He had, for the first time in years, space in his life for another arrival. They turned down a narrow street lined with plane trees and tiny shops. The orphanage sat at the end like a brick tooth in the row of houses. Strings of yellow bulbs haloed over the doorway. A painted sun the color of egg yolk beaming on the battered wall. Children's voices leapt and dipped in the wet air. A chorus of running feet, tinny carols, someone shouting a name with theatrical triumph. The building smelled of hot soup and polish and the faint sulfur of burnished candles on the mantel. A line of small boots left inkblot prints on the step. Inside, Donna Fatima met them at the door with a coat wrapped tight against the damp. Her eyes were soft and sharp at once. Years of looking at paperwork and bedtime fears had given them a particular brightness. She took Leo by the shoulder like he was another child she had to count, and then she leaned toward Daniel with the sort of look that spoke both gratitude and quiet alarm. "We have more children than chairs this year," she said, and Daniel saw the ledger behind her eyes. Numbers that did not add up. Heating bills with corners folded over like worried hands. "We did not plan for the storm that closed the grant. For tonight we will be all together, but we need everything." Daniel folded his hands and let himself be practical. A check for the immediate shortfall, his promise to gather volunteers for the pantry, a call to the school to hold places for the children. He said it without drama. He would pay the immediate bills, he would find a sustainable way forward. Donna Fatima's mouth curved. She let him in. They filed into the common room, a square of mismatched tables and a tree that leaned like the shy guest. The children circled the room like small planets, some orbiting the punch bowl, others clustered in a corner with construction paper crowns. Leo darted forward as if answering an internal command. He had been practicing bravery in his pockets all week. Daniel watched his son become a comet, small hands offering cookies, small shoulders pushing gently into a line. Then his eyes snagged on a different silhouette. In the far corner, beneath the yellow sun painted on the wall, a little girl sat folded into herself. Her coat was too big, sleeves swallowing her wrists. She hugged a frayed teddy, Tico, so close the bear's fur was smushed flat against her cheek. Her hair was cropped in an uneven line, and her eyes looked like the spaces in between sentences, attentive, guarded, unreadable. Leo was already moving toward her before Daniel could speak. The boy's hand outstretched with the uncalculated certainty of small generosity. He slid beside her and offered the paper crown without flourish. "Hi," Leo said. "I'm Leo. Want to wear this? It makes you king." She blinked slowly, as if the crown were a strange hinge to be tried. Her finger found the worn seam of Tico's ear and smoothed it, a ritual of ownership. Then she put the crown on, a crooked coronation, and her mouth tilted, just a little. Daniel felt his chest unclench in response, like someone setting down a weight. "She's Lara," Donna Fatima told him when she came close. "Quiet as winter. She's been here since last spring." That night, Daniel offered, gently, an overnight invitation. It was an old habit his father had taught him, how to ask a favor without shaming, how to make room. "If she ever needs a night outside here," he said, more to Donna Fatima than to Lara, "we have an extra bed. Leo would love the company." There was no grand declaration, only a small, practical gesture. Dona Fatima looked at Lara, and Lara's fingers braided the frayed seam of Tico as if testing an old knot. She nodded imperceptibly. So they walked home under the rain and brought Lara back to a house warmed by rice cooking and the low hum of the heater. Leo showed her the top bunk like a treasure. Lara tucked Tico under the blanket as if the bear had been waiting. Small rituals built trust faster than speeches. Leo insisted on the Mindinho promise. Pinkies linked in the kitchen while they ate soup, a solemn agreement that they would look after each other. Lara's laugh was a thin blade at first, then broadened into honest, startled delight when Leo told a silly knock-knock joke. The next Saturday, they returned with a crate of paints, and Lara painted a sun on the cardboard like the one outside the orphanage. She used a fingertip to drag the color until it shone. The sun began to follow her like a secret. A month of small visits, of dinners that smelled of citrus and cumin and the squeal of wooden chairs, knitted the edges of a new household. Daniel watched and learned the shape of Lara's silences. She answered in gestures more than words, in the precise way she folded the napkin or the way she arranged Tico beside the lamp at bedtime. He learned to find her in the playroom by her quietness. Leo learned to read her eyes like a map and knew when to hand over a crayon and when to make a ridiculous face. Yet the orphanage's ledger kept ticking in the corner of Daniel's mind. Paperbacks about philanthropy did not prepare him for the hum of a furnace that couldn't be repaired without money, the letter from the city that mentioned budgetary reassignment, the list of children who might have to be moved to smaller homes. He spent hours hunched at his kitchen table making phone calls that were less glamorous than he'd pictured, arranging volunteers, negotiating with a supplier for a discount on paint, apologizing politely to funders who had promises delayed. He paid the overdue bills with a single transaction and then worked to make that payment last. Word of the children's needs spread quietly through the neighborhood. Neighbors joined on weekends to sweep floors and fix shelves. Volunteers painted the sun mural until the wall looked like a morning that refused to go away. The orphanage kitchen began to smell of soup that reminded people of their childhoods. Old ladies who had once baked for school carnivals handed over recipes on folded index cards. Daniel organized a calendar for donations and a roster for repairs. And when the city clerk requested an inspection, he was there with a clipboard and the steady neutrality of someone who had bought a small kingdom of patience. It was during a pantry stock day that their world broadened in a direction no spreadsheet had predicted. A limousine idled at the curb with a quiet like someone who had practiced silence. A smaller car beside it had his name plastered on a list the orphanage had never expected. Excited whispers threaded through the room like a new tune. Justin Bieber, Daniel had to say the name out loud as though pronunciation could make it less surreal, was scheduled to visit that evening as part of a holiday outreach. He had brought a small troupe, a piano, and a trained monkey. It could have been a spectacle, Daniel thought, a celebrity parade to be overheard and forgotten. Instead, the star's presence arrived like a gift wrapped in gentleness. Justin moved carefully among the children, his voice soft when he spoke, laughter that was quick and unpretentious. He made jokes that were simple and bright. He answered questions with attention. The monkey, Milo, according to a small sign, wore a tiny scarf and had a curious, patient face. The trainers kept their distance. Milo's eyes took in the room with an animal's clean appraisal. The scheduled moment came after dinner, when the lights were dimmed and the tree leaned in toward the center of the room. Justin sat at the piano and plucked a few notes. The sound unfolded like a ribbon. He sang a song that was not about fame or lights, but about being held, about small hands finding each other. The children, packed close on cushions and laps and knees, looked like a festival of small faces. Then Milo did something that had nothing to do with training. He moved across the floor toward the corner where Lara sat, clutching Tico. For a second, the adults held their breath as if the scene were a fragile thing. Milo took Tico in his small, precise hands. He did not pull or tease. He tilted the bear's head and then, with the solemnness of a small priest, presented the bear back to Laura. The movement was almost theatrical, an offering and a benediction in one. Laura's fingers stopped mid-fold. Her eyes widened. Milo perched on her knee and, with the cautious curiosity of a child testing water, touched his tiny, practiced hand to her mindinho, the little finger Leo had used in the kitchen promise. Leo, who was close by, watched and then slipped his own pinky into Laura's without thinking, and Daniel felt the air in his chest change. No one clapped right away. The room sat in the hush that follows the simplest of truths. Something that had been knotted inside the children, loneliness, hunger for recognition, the small daily erosion of self, unwound a little. Tears came, first in the corner of one volunteer's eye, then in Dina Fatima's throat, then on Leo's face like a small, honest rain. Laura put her hand on Milo, then on Tico, then on Leo's hand. The monkey's act, a gentle mimic, had made a public gesture of intimacy safe for children who had learned to keep everything private. After the music, when the cameras that someone had smartly placed against the wall were turned off and the lights rose back up, donors came forward in a way that did not feel like spectacle. A local baker pledged to provide bread every week. A neighborhood fund offered to cover repairs. Justin, who had no need to advertise his presence, quietly arranged for a series of small, sustained donations through a foundation manager who preferred to speak in numbers rather than press releases. People asked how to help. They signed up for shifts. The orphanage's list of needs shrank like a shadow at noon. The crisis did not evaporate overnight. There were nights Daniel woke at 3, mapped the orphanage's cash flow in his head like a chess game he'd never learned to play. There were bureaucratic visits from officials and polite forms that needed signatures. But a rhythm had changed. Attention had arrived as a steady drumbeat rather than a once-off trumpet. Volunteers painted until their hands were streaked with yellow and blue. The kitchen got a new pot. The furnace, patched and coaxed, learned to keep warm. Tico, who had been flattened and private, was washed and fluffed and given a little scarf that matched the mural's sun. The mural itself, which a team of kids had been allowed to help repaint one long weekend, grew brighter. As the practical tasks rolled forward, so did the quieter work of attachment. Leo and Laura invented a secret ritual of drawing a house together, in pencil mostly, then in colored crayon, then in paints. They always drew 3 stick figures inside, one with a tie, Daniel, one small and round, Leo, and one with a tiny bow on her head, Laura. They hid the drawings in the hollow of the breakfast table, as if the table were a safe. The drawing became their talisman. When some bureaucrats spoke in flat tones about placement and reassignment, Daniel would pull the drawing and smooth it out, and something in him that answered to tenderness would click back into place. One rainy afternoon, while clearing out a file cabinet of the orphanage's old registration papers, an exercise in charity that felt suspiciously like archaeology, Dona Fatima found a thin envelope, yellow with age. Inside was a folded letter and a name, Carolina Mendez. There was a small note in a mother's handwriting, careful and looping, that said simply, "If anything happens to me, if I cannot be there, please find Daniel Oliveira. He will know what to do." There was a photocopy of an old pay stub with the same name, and a photograph cut so small you needed a glass to see the face. A young woman with a lopsided grin and a necklace that had a small sun-shaped charm. Daniel held the photograph as if it might heat his palm. He had not known Carolina. He had never met her. He had never been asked to be a guardian in a letter he did not remember. But the name on the letter lodged like a small stone in the river of his intentions. There was, in the thin folding of paper, the whisper of a request that felt like a trust left in the dark. He remembered then a brief passage of memory that adjusted meaning. 5 years ago, a woman had run late for a meeting at his office to ask for a small favor about rent for a flat owned by a family trust he managed. He had signed a piece of paper without much thought and had never met her again. It was a loose, almost accidental link, but combined with the note, it became a hinge. Daniel felt the decentering that sometimes accompanies decisions that are moral more than logistical. He could argue the numbers, the custody hurdles, the inconvenient complexities. Or he could do what the letter asked: step in. He did not rush to spectacle. There were social worker meetings, gentle interviews in a room that smelled like coffee and paper, where Laura's sleeping habits, her food preferences, the way she reacted to noise were cataloged with professional care. Volunteers wrote letters recommending him. The city official who handled placement sat with him at a small table and drew out the same list of questions Daniel had been rehearsing alone in his head. What was his schedule? Who would care for Laura if he had to go on a trip? How would Leo respond to sharing a room? Daniel answered with practical truth and with an honesty that sometimes carries more weight than polish. The legal steps were compressed, careful, bureaucratic, and human all at once. A court hearing that was more formality than theater, a social worker's final note that said in plain sentences that Laura had flourished in their care and that Daniel had provided a stable and loving environment. The judge wore no robes of thunder. She asked about Tico and the sun mural and whether Leo understood what it meant to be a brother. Leo nodded solemnly, as if swearing to a small binding oath. The paperwork concluded with a single stamped page that felt, to Daniel, like a years-long breath exhaled. When the adoption was finalized, it felt less like victory and more like a settling. There was a small ceremony, the orphanage staff present, Justin's manager sending a brief message of support, and Dona Fatima holding back tears as if she had been saving them for months. Laura clung to Tico and put her hand in Daniel's in the kind of grip that made language surplus. They walked home together under strings of city lights that blurred into guilt, and Leo skipped ahead and turned to check they were all together. Life after legal papers rearranged itself into simple threads of routine and wonder. Laura learned to climb the bus steps without being frightened of the height. She learned to write her name in the scrawl Daniel practiced with patient repetition. School enrollment was a morning of careful files and reassuring talk from a teacher who wore thick glasses and a smile that fit like an open door. The schoolyard was a place of new noises: tag, scuffed knees, shouted math answers, the clack of lunch trays. Daniel watched her walk into a classroom that smelled of chalk and glue and imagined decades ahead where small hands grew into different shapes. There were quieter moments, too. The first night Laura slept in a room plastered with stars, Tico tucked into a little bed of his own atop a shelf, Leo reading aloud with the earnest cadence of someone practicing guardianship. There were small crises: a stomach bug that stole half a week of plans, a broken window that needed to be boarded up by volunteers with paint-splattered gloves, but these were solved by a community that had learned to act, to come when asked. Daniel's definition of wealth shifted subtly. It became time again, availability, a steady presence at the sink when pasta needed stirring, and at the desk when homework needed checking. Months later, on an anniversary of sorts, the day the sun mural had been repainted and the orphanage had finally posted a balanced ledger, Justin returned. He came quietly, without the flurry of press this time, with Milo trotting at his heels like an old friend. The artist sat in the back and watched the children, who greeted him with the lack of starstruck awe that comes after fame becomes a neighbor rather than a meteor. Milo, who had once given Laura Tico back in a gesture that had opened a room full of hearts, ambled forward and took up a spot beside the paint-splattered wall. Daniel stood on the threshold of the room and watched the boy he had once been hovering in his son's expression. Leo had grown a little taller, his hair a little long at the ears, his hands now wearing scabs and paint and the comfortable marks of a life lived. Laura stood by his side, a son of her own, and when Milo pressed a small, soft hand into Laura's, they both laughed, the sound clean and irrepressible. They posed for no photographs, except the ones printed and kept in an envelope at the breakfast table. The drawing of the house with 3 figures, the one they had once hidden in the hollow of the table, was framed now in a hallway. Above the little frame, Daniel had painted, in a child's hand, a small yellow sun. On the final evening of that winter, they decorated the tree together and set a crown on Leo's head, and Laura put Tico beside the presents in a place of honor. The house smelled of cinnamon and roasting apples, the front window fogged with the breath of the night. Daniel looked at his two children, blood and chosen, and felt the long, steady rise of belonging settle like warm light into the rooms of his heart. Outside, a train murmured by, and the rain, at last, eased. Inside, the sun mural's painted rays seemed to lean toward the window, as if to see what had become of its small, hopeful town. When the lights on the tree blinked, they were not a spectacle, but a punctuation to a sentence that had taken months to arrive: home. Morning followed the tree lights as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and yet everything had shifted by the small, faithful gravity of domestic ritual. Breakfast was a slow orchestra, the hiss of an espresso machine, a spatula clinking against a pan, a sleeve wiped across a cheek that still smelled faintly of sleep. Lara insisted on putting jam on only one half of her toast, and argued, with the solemn logic of a child, that this was how balance worked. Leo practiced a new skateboard trick on the stoop until Daniel had to call him away, because the neighbor's cat, a sovereign furball called Madam, had taken offense and made a slow, deliberate retreat across the front garden. Days unrolled into a moderate steadiness. Daniel found himself measuring time in smaller units than years. The number of times Leo scraped his knee in a season, the way Lara said Daniel with such thin, private affection that it might have been an incantation. The Tuesday evening when Milo came by and painted a stripe of cobalt along the side of the house because it needed more sky. Work fit around these increments, emails answered at odd hours, site meetings that Daniel scheduled to leave in time for school pickup. But his ambitions had been reweighted. He refused, now, to let career decisions press into the space their life required. There were compromises, fewer late nights, a client politely declined. But there was also a view that richness was not measured in increase of bank balances alone. The neighborhood responded to their household in small and predictable ways. Donna Fatima settled into the rhythm of Sunday dinners, where she ladled stew and watched the children with the proud, half-critical indulgence of someone who had once been the housekeeper of the world. Justin checked in often enough to feel like an ally and not an intrusion. Milo slipped into the back door without knocking sometimes, carrying a half-painted wooden horse or a sketch he'd done of Laura sleeping with Tico, curled like a comma at her feet. Volunteers came and went. Teachers, a woman who mended socks in exchange for gossip, a retired mail carrier who taught Leo how to whistle so that the sound could be both a warning and a promise. Not all changes were easy. Leo's school day began to widen beyond scraped knees. He found himself awkward in a crowd of older boys, trying to negotiate who he was beneath the role of brother and varnished guardian. He wanted to be reckless sometimes, to test the edges of himself in ways Daniel both feared and understood. One afternoon he was sent home because of a fight that had started over the placement of the soccer ball near a bicycle rack. The principal called Daniel, and when he arrived, he watched Leo shrink under the weight of his own fierce temper. They sat on the bench beneath a plane tree and spoke by degrees. Daniel told stories of his childhood, short, selected memories that did not explain everything but offered proof that mistakes could be worked into a life. With Lara, it was quieter work. She asked questions that landed like soft stones in Daniel's chest. "Why don't I have my other name anymore?" she asked once, tracing a groove in the countertop. "Do I have a mother?" The word mother vibrated in the kitchen air, and for a moment neither of them moved. Daniel had rehearsed answers in his head, simple truths, the gentle insistence that families arrive by many paths, but the real world was never as tidy as rehearsals. "We found you because someone small and brave left you where you would be safe," he said. He chose words that felt honest and protective at once. Some people had a hard time and couldn't keep you. Others, people like me, like Leo, decided to keep loving you. That doesn't make the rest of it less true. You can hold both things. Lara accepted this with the patient prudency of a child who had already learned loss. She drew pictures in the margins of her homework, houses with 2 suns, a dog with 3 tails.
At night, she sometimes dreamed of a long corridor filled with doors. Behind one, she swore, someone was humming a tune she half remembered. Daniel would sit on the edge of her bed, the light pooling on the duvet, and let her tell him what she could. The telling was itself a kind of joining. One rainy Wednesday in late spring, an envelope arrived that smelled faintly of the outside: pollen, dust, a trace of coffee. It had no return address. The handwriting was small and urgent.
Daniel had a stack of mail on the hallway table, a glossy flyer about a neighborhood cleanup, a postcard from a consulting firm. So the letter might have gone unnoticed if not for the way Laura's small fingers had hovered over it before him, and their names had been written across the front: Laura. For Daniel, the name on the outside made the air in the kitchen change. He slid a letter opener along the fold with the careful deliberation he used for anything fragile. Inside was a single page, the ink slightly smudged at the edges, as though written in haste. It began, simply, "My name is Anna." There was no flourish, only an accounting of absence. A few sentences about fear, about not knowing where to turn, about how time had taught steadiness and regret in equal measure. She wrote that she had watched from afar when the orphanage posted photos, those weeks when the agency had sent updates, and had seen a small girl with a crooked tooth and unruly hair who she thought might be hers. She wrote that she had not been able to find a way to reach out before the adoption, that she had been ashamed and was ashamed still. She asked, without a tone of demand, if it would be possible to meet, to tell Laura the things she did not know, to show her a patchwork of pictures, to answer questions that might arise. The letter, folded in Daniel's hands, felt like a pebble dropped into water. It created rings, questions that widened toward the edges of everything they had built. He did not know what a father was meant to do in face of such a thing. He pictured, for a dizzy second, a courtroom, an angry agent, papers stamped and countersigned. He also pictured Laura, who had just learned how to draw two sons, whose trust in the steady routine of their mornings was a fragile architecture that could be undermined by too much storm. He walked to the living room where Donna Fatima sat mending a sweater. The old woman did not look surprised. The way her hands moved with the needle suggested she'd expected interruptions of every kind. "Someone wrote," Daniel said. He did not conceal the letter. Donna Fatima read, her mouth a thin line, and then she put the page down as if it were a tiny bird. "People come back," she said. "Some to pick, some to look, some for themselves. You must be careful, Menino." That night the family gathered in the narrow way they always did when the world was a little too sharp. Around the table, under the lamp's small pool of light. Leo listened with a guarded face, and Laura asked a single precise question: "Does she know my name?" before she went to bed. On the couch, Milo said little, but reached across and laid his hand over Daniel's for a second, an unspoken offering of solidarity. Justin, who had come by with Milo, asked a practical question about timing and process, what steps Daniel thought they needed to take. The conversation went on for an hour, and then another, drifting into small logistical eddies. Who would be present at a meeting? Whether the orphanage kept records of photographs, if it was better to bring someone else as a witness. Daniel found himself torn between two instincts. One was to protect the sense of completion they had fought so long to create, to hold tightly to the world where Laura belonged without fissures. The other was to honor the truth written on that single sheet, that a human had once looked at the child with regret and was seeking some measure of reconciliation. He had been a child once and known the hollow of someone gone. He understood what it meant to crave a little more information about the shape of one's own beginning. In the days that followed, he sought counsel like a man building a bridge, careful, measured, and with an eye for unseen currents. He spoke with the orphanage director, who confirmed that Anna had indeed visited months earlier, asking questions that were left in the dossier and never acted upon. The director had not felt she was ready for a meeting then.
There were, the director reminded Daniel gently, procedures and legal boundaries. There always were. But there was also a human element that documents could not account for. Leo took the news as boys often do, with bluster, a show of invulnerability. But at night, Daniel found him awake in his room, the covers twisted around his legs, and they had a conversation that was less about law than about fear. "If she comes," Leo said, "what if she takes her away?" "She can't," Daniel replied. His voice held the steadiness he did not always feel. "We are her family. Laws make that very clear. But listen, if she comes, it won't be to take. Most of the time, it's to answer questions that only a person can answer." Leo regarded him, then shoved his skateboard under the bed as if in surrender. "Promise me you'll tell me everything." "I promise." The first meeting was arranged in a public room at the orphanage, a middle ground where memory and present could be negotiated with witnesses nearby. Daniel wanted to be there for Laura, but he also wanted to shield her from a hurt she was not equipped to carry alone. When the day arrived, the sky had that thin, anxious light of early summer. Laura sat between Daniel and Leo, clutching Tico like a talisman. Dona Fatima sat across from them, her posture a small fortress. Anna arrived with hands that shook only a little, and eyes that were both weary and bright. She wore a plain dress and a scarf knotted at the throat. Daniel caught the smell of boiled linen and lavender. She sat slowly, as if the motion of sitting required permission. Her gaze went straight to Laura, and for a moment the room changed into one of those quiet theaters where history and present held their breath together.
She spoke haltingly at first, telling the story of a short, hard life. A childhood without many options, a man who was not kind, pregnancies that were managed in secret, doors opened and closed. She did not ask for permission to be forgiven. Instead, she catalogued the facts, where she had been, why she had left Laura at the orphanage's gate, a choice made in the rawness of survival, and how, in the years since, she had learned the shape of her errors. She had come mostly to answer the small practical things, a lullaby's melody, a scar behind the left ear where a fever had been treated quickly, the fact that someone had once called Laura La as a nickname. Laura listened with the inscrutable concentration of a child who had long practiced attention in order to feel safe. At one point, Anna smiled so fiercely that Daniel felt something like thaw in his own chest. She extended a small, worn photograph. An instant of sunlight, a kitchen table, a pair of small hands. Laura took the photo with trembling fingers and pressed it to her chest. "I don't need you to be anything but honest," Anna said. "I do not demand you forgive me. I only want you to know I'm here, now, if you ever need to ask." The meeting concluded in a way that left no final answers. There were no declarations of reclamation, no promises that solved the ache of absence. Instead, there was the slow folding of two lives into a shared room of possibility. Anna left with a small card that had a number on it, and Daniel watched her go with the particular sorrow that comes when someone departs whom the world has failed. He felt a protective, paternal surge of anger, and then a softer sadness that the world had made such mistakes possible. That night, after the children slept, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the photograph spread under his lamp. He thought of beginnings and how fragile they were, how often they depended on brittle choices. He thought of the many people who had made him who he was, some absent, some present, and he felt, with the slow certainty of seasons, that his responsibility was not to deny the past, but to hold it against the present and weave them together carefully. He did not yet know what the next months would bring. There would be phone calls, perhaps a visit from Anna, an attempt to sketch a new kind of relationship that would belong to Laura and no one else. There would be questions for lawyers, for social workers, for the patient volunteers who had learned to translate difficult truths into kinder languages. There would also be ordinary mornings, school lunches, scraped knees, midnight coughs, and the small domestic miracles that had taught him the most about what it meant to be a parent. Outside, the city hummed along its small committed routes. Milo's cobalt stripe on the house glittered under a passing shower. Leo dreamed of skating down a hill and landing a trick that would make him feel brave. Laura placed the photograph on the mantel between a framed drawing of the three-figure house and the painted yellow sun. Daniel reached out and, without thinking, smoothed the tiny smudge on the image with the pad of his thumb. The smear did not spoil the scene. If anything, it made it more human. He leaned back in his chair and let the tiredness seep through him. The future, he thought, was not a single bright street, but a braided path with forks and reunions and unanticipated turns. He would make decisions by the measure of what the children needed and by the measure of truth. Above all, he would keep showing up. Soon enough, the bell of his phone would ring with new proposals from work, new invitations, new minor crises that would demand his attention. He folded the photograph into the drawer where he kept the adoption papers and the small things that told of beginning. For a long time, he sat with his hands folded and thought of home. Not as an endpoint, but as something living, a place that required tending, honesty, and the courage to let strangers become part of it when they asked in the right way. When he finally climbed the stairs to bed, Leo's door was ajar, and a faint light showed a silhouette bent over homework, a pencil moving like a quiet metronome. Daniel paused, watching the ordinary figure of his son. He walked in and sat on the edge of the bed. "You okay?" he asked. Leo looked up, more adult in that moment than his years warranted. "Yeah," he hesitated. "If she comes back, can I meet her too?" Daniel thought of the night he had met his own father for the first time in years, and how hollow some meetings can be, and how full others. He knew the answer in the same way he knew the taste of coffee in the morning. "Yes," he said, "if you want to." Leo nodded once and went back to his homework. Daniel stayed a moment longer, feeling both the weight of responsibility and the gentle lift that comes when you choose again and again to be present. Outside, the rain stopped, and the moon cut a thin silver across the street. Inside, the painted sun above the hallway seemed to glow with a patient light, not because the paint was bright, but because the people who lived beneath it kept returning, day after day, to the business of belonging. Their lives were not finished. They had edges that needed tending, and questions that would require courage to answer. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel slept with a mind that could find quiet between the beats. Dawn would bring new decisions, new small mercies. For now, the house breathed like a thing alive, keeping watch. In the kitchen drawer, the letter from Anna rested against the adoption papers, two documents that spoke of endings and beginnings folded into one uncertain, promising present. Daniel thought of the way Leo had promised that day that he wanted to know everything, and of Laura pressing the photograph to her chest as if it were a small sudden star. They would learn, together, what that meant. They would argue and forgive and confide and, at times, falter. But they would return, as they had been doing all these months, to their table, their slow, ordinary altar, where jam was spread on toast and Tico snoozed and the painted sun looked on with the quiet approval of someone who had seen many winters. Outside, a bus pulled away with a hiss, and the city, waking, began to stir. The day ahead would require choices. Daniel rose and went to the window, hands pressed to the cool glass, and watched the street fill with movement. He did not yet have answers, but he had the children, and he had the steadiness of the house that had become home. He breathed in, let the air settle, and stepped into the day with them. He made coffee with the slow, familiar gestures of someone who had learned to make peace with mornings. The kettle sang gently on the stove, and the light through the kitchen window picked out dust like a fine constellation. Leo shuffled in with his backpack slung over one shoulder, hair still damp from a hurried shower, and Milo brushed against Daniel's leg, tail a soft metronome. Laura moved between them with a jar of jam and 2 mugs, an easy rhythm of small domestic mercies. "Smell that?" she said, and the house answered in the plain way of things that belong to people. The cat hopped down from the table, hopped up again, circled Daniel's feet. Tico blinked with sovereign patience. Daniel set the photograph back on the mantel, where the small smudge caught the light and seemed to make the faces in it softer,
more alive. The phone finally rang mid-toast, its sound less urgent than a summons. It belonged to the world, not to the small weather of the house. Daniel hesitated only a beat before picking up. The voice on the other end was polite and brisk, an editor from a magazine he had once imagined writing for regularly, offering him a series of commissioned pieces, an opportunity to travel for a month and produce a profile series. It sounded like the sort of thing that would pad the bank account and the ego in equal measure. For a while he listened, letting argument and calculation recede and return like tide lines. When he glanced up, Leo was watching him from the doorway, chin tucked into his scarf. Lara watched too, the edge of the jam knife paused in the air. Daniel thought of the adoption papers folded into the drawer, the letter from Anna nested against them. He thought of promises, not the dramatic kind, but the daily, quieter ones made by showing up. He thought, as he always did these mornings, about how each choice had its own weight. "I'm flattered," he said finally, voice steady, "but not now. Tell me when you're ready to meet something that needs a man at home. Maybe later, but not while they're small." There were professional ways to decline. He used none of them.
The editor made a noise like understanding and then offered him a smaller, local assignment instead, something he could do without leaving town. Daniel accepted with a relief that felt almost indecent. The phone clicked into silence, and for a moment after, the house seemed to breathe with him. He set the handset down, and Milo gave a small, contented woof. They ate quietly, the three of them, and the conversation turned to homework and to an argument Leo had had the day before at school about a math problem. The conversation left ready spaces where heavier things might sit. The subject of Anna's letter hovered in one of those spaces until Daniel reached for it. He walked to the drawer and slid it out with the same care he used when handling fragile things. The paper was the sort Anna had used once before, slightly creased at the edges, the ink smudged in places as if written hurriedly or in a tremor. "Do you want to read it here?" Lara asked. Leo moved closer, then drew back. "I do," he said, "but only with you." They settled around the table. Tico made a slow circle, finding a place at Lara's feet. Daniel unfolded the letter. The handwriting was Anna's, familiar curves and slanted letters, and the first lines were quick, almost apologetic. She wrote that she had been thinking of them. She had found a flat 2 neighborhoods over and steady work. Nothing spectacular, she wrote, but enough to make a beginning. She asked gently if it would be possible to talk. She acknowledged the distance that years had put between them, and that the request might be sudden and unwelcome. She said she was sorry for the way she had left, and that she wanted, if they were willing, to see them and to answer whatever questions Leo had. Silence followed the last sentence, like an unlooked-for guest. Leo's pencil tapped the table, a soft, nervous beat. Lara's hand found his and squeezed once. Her thumb left a small track through the flour on her fingers. Daniel read the letter twice. The second time he read it aloud, the words tasting like both possibility and risk. "She wants to meet," Leo said finally, in a voice that was not childish. "She says she'll answer my questions." Daniel felt an ache that was not wholly sorrowful. It was a complex, brambly thing: fear, hope, the memory of the face he had once seen in a photograph, and the picture of his son now grown in all those private shapes. There were practicalities to consider. Who would be there? Where would it be safe? Whether Leo might be hurt. There were also, under all of that, the simpler human truth that people return because some part of them could not bear to know what they had lost. "What do you want to do?" Lara asked. Her voice carried neither command nor plea, but a weary clarity. She trusted Daniel to lead, but she also wanted to be consulted. Leo looked from one to the other. "I want to meet her," he said, "but maybe not alone. Can you come? Can we go somewhere public? And—" he swallowed. "Can you tell me what to ask?" Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of his own first meeting with his father, the way the room had felt too loud, the way some apologies were like empty chairs. He thought also of the small, ordinary moments that had taught him what steadiness looked like, Making dinner, waking early to find a child's homework spread across the table, staying up while someone else cried and not leaving. Those things were not dramatic, they were durable. "We'll do it on our terms," he said. "Public place, someone with us. If we need a social worker or a mediator, we'll ask. We won't let anyone push this, least of all us. We'll ask the questions that matter, and if at any point it doesn't feel safe, we'll stop." Leo nodded, as if this was a map he could follow. Lara reached for Daniel's hand under the table. He felt the warmth there and let himself be steadied. They agreed, with small, cautious motions, to write back first. Daniel took a pen and folded a fresh sheet of paper. He wrote with the directness of someone who had learned the economy of words that mustn't do harm. He thanked Anna for the letter, acknowledged the courage it took to reach out, and suggested a meeting at the community cafe 2 streets over, a place with wide windows and other people around. He offered the option of a mediated meeting if she preferred, and asked whether she would be willing to answer some questions in writing before a first face-to-face. When he handed the reply to Lara, she read it over, then kissed the top of the page, as if sealing it with a silence that was also a benediction. Leo, who had watched the gestures of adulthood with a new hunger, said, "Can I sign it too?" "No," Daniel said immediately, then softened. "Or yes, if you want, but we will all sign as a family." They walked to the postbox together later that morning, the 3 of them moving as if their steps could make decisions heavier or lighter by being shared. Milo trotted at the curb, and a neighbor called out a greeting. The city had the small, good predictability of ordinary kindnesses. Daniel thought of how many things he could not control: Anna's reaction, what would be said, how Leo might feel afterward. But he also thought of the things he could: the way they showed up, the boundaries they set, the honesty they chose. At the postbox, he felt, briefly and clearly, that being a parent was less about protecting from reality than about giving tools to meet it. He slid the envelope through the slot and felt the finality of that small action. It was not a closing, but a step. On the walk back, they passed a playground where a child was learning to ride without training wheels, and a woman clapped as if the world might disintegrate if the child fell. Lara stopped and watched, a smile pulled tight and lovely around her eyes. Daniel watched his son and his wife, and felt something like gratitude, sharp and abundant. They returned to the house and sat at the table again, the painted sun on the wall watching over them. There were things to do: calls to return, a school form to sign, a leaky faucet to fix. Small, inevitable work. But the letter had opened a door, and beyond it lay a corridor of possibilities and cautions. For now, they would walk it together, the 3 of them, measuring each step by the needs of the child and the firmness of the love that had built the house into a home. As the afternoon leaned toward evening, Daniel found himself thinking less of answers and more of the act of keeping company with one another through whatever came. The world would ask them for compromises and decisions. For that night, at least, they had chosen each other. Outside the windows, light fell golden and ordinary over the street. Inside, they began to prepare dinner, an unremarkable stew that would carry them through the week, while the city carried on with its private urgencies. Daniel washed a pot and hummed a tune he could not name. Leo set the table, careful as if making order would hold more than cutlery and mugs. Lara stirred the stew and tasted for salt. When dishes were done and the house had the soft sigil of a day completed, Daniel sat on the sill and watched the street settle. He did not know how the meeting would go. He did not know whether Anna's words would bring repair or further fissures. He did know, with a quiet clarity he had earned, that they would face whatever came as a family. Whatever came next, they would keep returning to their slow altar, jam on toast, a sleeping cat, a painted sun, and choose over and over the work of belonging.